The gavel slammed down, echoing through the tense courtroom. "Kneel," barked the judge. All eyes turned to the black veteran standing tall at the podium, refusing to bow. The air crackled with shock and outrage. No one could believe what was happening. Anthony Carter, a 62-year-old black Army veteran, stood as a symbol of resilience and honor. With 30 years of service, he had led troops through the chaos of foreign wars, earning a Purple Heart for his bravery and sacrifice. His military career was marked by discipline, leadership, and a deep sense of justice. After retiring, Anthony returned to his hometown, Harmony Creek, hoping for peace but finding a new mission, advocating for veterans' rights and fighting discrimination. Anthony's life was shaped by both the pride of his service and the scars of prejudice. He had faced subtle and overt racism throughout his career, but his military training taught him to stand tall, never yielding to injustice. In civilian life, he became a mentor to young veterans, a volunteer at community centers, and a vocal supporter of equal rights. His reputation for integrity and courage made him a respected figure in the community, though not everyone welcomed his activism. Despite his achievements, Anthony remained humble. He dressed simply, favoring worn jackets and old boots over medals and uniforms. His eyes, sharp and steady, reflected both the pain of past battles and the hope for a better future. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his posture slightly stooped from old injuries but his spirit unbroken. Anthony's commitment to justice led him to work with the Federal Civil Rights Division, where he volunteered for undercover investigations into systemic discrimination. When reports of racial bias and abuse of power surfaced at the Harmony Creek courthouse, Anthony knew he had to act. He agreed to go undercover, risking his safety to expose the truth. For Anthony, this was not just another mission, it was a personal stand against the injustice he had fought his whole life. The trouble began when Anthony received a confidential file from the Civil Rights Division. The Harmony Creek courthouse had become notorious for its harsh treatment of minorities, especially black defendants. Complaints poured in, unfair sentences, abusive officers, and a judge whose reputation for bias was an open secret. The federal team needed irrefutable evidence, and Anthony was the perfect candidate to gather it. Assuming the identity of Tony Bell, an unemployed black veteran with a minor record, Anthony moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town. He dressed in faded clothes, walked with a slight limp, and kept a low profile. The plan was simple: attract the attention of officers Miller and Davis, two men infamous for their aggressive tactics and racial profiling. One evening, Anthony deliberately lingered near a closed storefront, pretending to search for something in his bag. As expected, a patrol car pulled up. Miller, the larger officer, stepped out first, his eyes cold and suspicious. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Davis, younger and cockier, circled behind Anthony, hand resting on his baton. "I'm just heading home," Anthony replied, keeping his voice soft and unthreatening. "Home? You don't look like you belong here," Miller sneered. "Show us some ID." Anthony fumbled in his bag, acting nervous. I think I left it at home." Davis smirked. "Wandering around at night with no ID? That's suspicious." The officers pressed him with questions, their tone growing more hostile. Finally, Miller grabbed Anthony's arm. "You're coming with us. Let's see what the judge thinks about vagrants like you." Anthony was handcuffed and shoved into the back of the patrol car. Hidden microphones and cameras, expertly placed by the federal team, recorded every word and gesture. The arrest was rough, the charges fabricated: vagrancy and resisting arrest. At the station, Anthony was booked and held overnight. The next morning, he was told he would appear before Judge Arthur Albright, a man whose name was whispered with fear and resentment in the black community. The federal team, disguised as court staff and observers, prepared to document everything that happened in the courtroom. Anthony's heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and resolve. He knew the risks, but he also knew the importance of this mission. This was his chance to expose the rot at the heart of Harmony Creek's justice system. The holding cell was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair. Anthony sat on a hard bench, his hands resting on his knees, replaying the events of the night before. He remembered the sneers of Miller and Davis, the rough grip on his arms, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in the town he once called home. A weary public defender, Mr. Peterson, arrived with a stack of files under his arm. He glanced at Anthony, his eyes tired and resigned. "You're Tony Bell?" he asked. Anthony nodded. "Yes, sir." Peterson sighed. "You've been charged with vagrancy and resisting arrest. My advice? Plead guilty. The judge is tough, especially on cases like yours. You might get off with a fine or a few days of community service." Anthony shook his head. "I'm innocent. I want to fight this." Peterson looked at him, surprised. "It's your right, but I have to warn you, Judge Albright doesn't like troublemakers. And with Miller and Davis as witnesses, it's an uphill battle." Anthony thanked him but stood firm. He would not plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit. As Peterson left, Anthony took a deep breath, steeling himself for the trial ahead. He thought of his fellow veterans, of the young men and women who looked up to him, and of the countless people who had suffered in silence. He would not let them down. The courtroom was small and dimly lit, the wood paneling worn and faded. American and state flags hung behind the judge's bench, their colors dulled by years of neglect. Anthony was led in, shackled and dressed in a plain orange jumpsuit. He kept his head high, refusing to let the indignity break his spirit. Judge Arthur Albright entered with a flourish, his face red and eyes sharp. He glanced at Anthony with thinly veiled contempt. The prosecutor, eager to impress, read out the charges, exaggerating Anthony's supposed crimes. Miller and Davis sat nearby, their faces smug. "Mr. Bell," the judge began, "you stand accused of vagrancy and resisting arrest. Officers Miller and Davis report that you were uncooperative and disrespectful. How do you plead?" "Innocent, Your Honor," Anthony replied, his voice steady. The judge's lips curled. "Of course you do. People like you always have an excuse." Anthony tried to explain, but Albright interrupted, dismissing his words. The prosecutor called Miller and Davis to testify. They repeated their lies, painting Anthony as a threat. The judge nodded approvingly, barely listening to Anthony's defense. When Anthony requested to review the police report, Albright's patience snapped. "You dare question my court? You dare challenge the word of my officers," he thundered. Anthony stood his ground. "I only ask for fairness, Your Honor." Albright's face darkened. "You show no respect. In my courtroom, you will kneel as a sign of submission. Kneel, or face contempt charges." A gasp rippled through the room. Anthony's eyes blazed with defiance. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I will not kneel." The judge slammed his gavel. "Officers, make him kneel." Miller and Davis rose, moving toward Anthony with malicious intent. The tension in the room was electric, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. As Miller and Davis closed in, Anthony straightened his back, his military bearing unmistakable. He looked each officer in the eye, unflinching. "You will not touch me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Miller hesitated, thrown off by Anthony's sudden change in demeanor. Davis glanced at the judge, uncertain. Anthony reached into the collar of his jumpsuit and pulled out a hidden badge. "I am Anthony Carter, retired Army Colonel and federal investigator with the Civil Rights Division. This entire proceeding has been recorded." The courtroom froze. Albright's face drained of color. Miller and Davis stepped back, their bravado evaporating. At that moment, several people in the gallery stood up, revealing themselves as federal agents. One, Agent Smith, addressed the court. "We have documented evidence of judicial misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. Judge Albright, Officers Miller and Davis, you are under investigation." The judge sputtered, trying to regain control. "This is my courtroom. "You have no authority here." Agent Smith replied, "On the contrary, Judge. We have full federal authority. You are to remain seated and surrender your credentials." Anthony turned to the onlookers, his voice steady. "Justice is not a privilege. It is a right. Today, we stand against abuse and discrimination." The agents moved quickly, securing the courtroom and collecting evidence. Miller and Davis were disarmed and separated. Albright was escorted from the bench, his authority shattered. The spectators, many of whom had suffered under Albright's rule, began to whisper, some weeping with relief. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Anthony stood tall, no longer a defendant but a champion of justice. The federal team took control of the courtroom, methodically gathering evidence. Recording devices were collected, statements taken from witnesses, and court staff interviewed. Anthony assisted, providing a detailed account of his experience and the abuses he had witnessed. Miller and Davis sat in stunned silence, their careers in ruins. Albright, stripped of his robe and authority, stared blankly at the floor. The agents ensured that all evidence was preserved and that the accused could not interfere with the investigation. Outside, news of the dramatic events spread quickly. Reporters gathered, eager for details. Community members, long frustrated by the courthouse's reputation, watched with a mix of hope and disbelief. Anthony addressed the crowd, urging them to stand up for their rights and to trust that justice would prevail. His words resonated, inspiring others to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment. The federal investigation expanded, reviewing years of cases handled by Albright, Miller, and Davis. Patterns of discrimination and abuse emerged, supported by testimony from victims and court records. Anthony worked closely with the team, helping to identify other instances of injustice. The media coverage was intense, sparking national debate about judicial reform and accountability. Advocacy groups rallied, demanding systemic change. The Department of Justice pledged to implement new training and oversight measures to prevent future abuses. Anthony's role was widely praised. He received messages of gratitude from across the country, but he remained focused on the work ahead. For him, the fight for justice was far from over. The trial of Albright, Miller, and Davis was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming: audio and video recordings, witness statements, and a clear pattern of misconduct. The jury found all three guilty of civil rights violations and abuse of power. Judge Albright was sentenced to 4 years in prison and permanently barred from holding judicial office. Miller and Davis received 1-year sentences and were banned from law enforcement. The verdict sent a powerful message: no one is above the law. Anthony attended the sentencing, watching as justice was finally served. He felt a sense of closure, knowing that his actions had made a difference. The courthouse underwent major reforms, with new leadership committed to fairness and equality. Anthony reflected on the journey. Justice had prevailed, but the struggle continued. He returned to his community, mentoring young veterans and advocating for reform. His story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that courage and integrity can change the world. To the audience, what would you do if you faced injustice like Anthony? How can we ensure our justice system is fair for everyone? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your voice matters. If you believe in standing up for justice and respecting those who serve, comment "respect" below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage and change.